Okay, we're all set. All right, so here we go. Oh, okay, sorry. So I love quotes, and I think that they're really powerful. And I think it's always a good thing to kind of start with. So it is time for parents to teach young children early on that in diversity there is beauty and there is strength. And I love starting with this because I feel like when we think about things like culture and diversity, and we talk about things like this, we make the assumption, so often we make the assumption that we're talking about something negative, that we're talking about discrimination and bias and all of those, like, quote unquote bad things, which they are bad things. But if that's all we're teaching our kids and that's all we're talking about, then we're missing it. We're missing a lot of it. There's a lot of beauty, a lot of strength in teaching different, being exposed to different people, different artwork, different foods, all of those different things. And so I think it's really important to keep in mind that when you're going to be having these conversations, when you're going to be talking about these things with your kids, it's not just going to be about the bad stuff, it's going to be about good things too. So I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. So just a general overview. So we'll be talking about definitions. I think definitions are actually really, really important. I think so often words are misused. And so I want to talk a little bit about what different things mean, so we're not using them as euphemisms for other things. And cultural competence and what a culturally competent kid is, I think defining that is really important. This is work that I've been doing more recently. I explained to Kate, this is actually something I'm writing a book on. So I'm deep in edits. Do I know when it's coming out? No, because I'm deep in edits, but I'm working on it. And so I've kind of come up with this overall framework of what a culturally competent kid is, what that kind of entails. So you have a sense of what you are working towards, right? I think when we talk about like culture and diversity, again, it's very, we're not quite sure what we're supposed to be moving towards, right? And so we want to kind of have a goal in mind. So we'll be defining that today. And then we'll go and get into what the framework is and what are the steps that you might be able to take to start this process. If nothing else, you're going to walk away with specific examples of things to do. I think that's so important. So often, again, people come and they want to talk about this topic with me or with other people, and people say like, oh, just read this book or like, watch this movie. And that's all well and good. But what else are we doing with that information? What else are we going? What are the specific things that we're doing? And once we do that thing, what's next? What can we keep going with? So you're going to be walking away with all of that. So there we go. So I think because we got started a little bit late, we're not going to do the activity, but just to describe it really quickly. So I love to start with this activity. I know a lot of like English teachers will start with this activities, like 7th and 8th grade English will do this and they'll do it as like a haiku. I am not it's not 7th grade and we're not in English class, so we're not going to do anything fancy like that. But I like the idea of thinking about ways for us to describe ourselves, like who we are, and what describes who we are. So I'll do it for myself personally, and then this is an activity that you all can do with each other, with your kids. I like the idea of doing it, as an individual and then exchanging with other people, right? Doing it, so that so you can see what other people's little biographies are. So I am Black, pretty obvious, right? I'm a woman, I'm a psychologist. One thing I want to point out as I'm thinking, so I have Black woman up there, right? Those are 2 areas of culture, very, very obvious, right? Of who I am. Very visible, right? So I think so often when we talk about culture, we talk about diversity, race and gender are the number one things that come to mind, right? That's the number one thing that people think about, for good reason, right? But there are lots of other areas of culture and we'll talk about those. But there is a reason why we talk about these areas so much, because they are so visible. They are in fact really salient as well. They really matter. In terms of being a psychologist, this is something actually that I find a lot of pride in, and something I feel very proud of being a psychologist and the work that I get to do. I think it's really wonderful and important. But one of the things that I actually recently had a conversation with my son about this. I have an 8th grade son who has one of his close friends is trans girl. And we recently had a conversation about the kind of the experience of what it means to be trans, and like how those experiences like how what his friend is experiencing is different from what people in the past have experienced. And one of the things that I brought up as a psychologist was that I said, as a psychologist, our profession has perpetuated a lot of harms against the LGBTQIA plus community. And, until the 1970s or something like that, is a part of our diagnostic manual, like being homosexual was in there, among other things. And so there are a lot of harms that, even though this is not something that I perpetuated and not something that I personally did, my profession, the profession that I chose, I'm a part of that. And so I have to own that. And so I was kind of modeling for my son both that, you can do good work and kind of rise above what has been true in the past, but I still take ownership of that, right? That's still a part of, who I am as a person. Mother, something really important. I just talked about my son, but I have a daughter as well. I'm a partner. I've been married a long time. It seems like a very long time at this point, but that's an important part of who I am, and a problem solver. And this is true in kind of all of the work that I do, right? So this is just a general biography. I love this as an icebreaker. If you're creative, you can do it as a haiku. I am not. But if you want to do that, I think that's great as well. So it's just a nice kind of way to get to talking about who you are, because part of the work to help our kids develop cultural competence is understanding who we are as individuals. And part of that is culture as well. All right, definitions. So definitions are really, really important. I think that words are very important. I think the words that we use are really important, and how we use them is important. So I almost always put diversity first, because I have a pet peeve. So the definition for diversity is difference, variety of a range of different things. What I often see is diversity being used as a euphemism for Black, for poor, for quote unquote urban, instead of being used in the way that it's actually intended. So for example, if you have a school that's 90% white, that's 90% upper middle class, that's 90%, it's in a suburban area, I don't think anyone would call that diverse, but we often see schools that are 95% Black in an urban area, is a Title IX school, so the kids receive free and reduced lunch. And we call that a diverse school. That's a huge pet peeve of mine. That is not a diverse school. That is not more diverse. In fact, it's less diverse than the previous school that I just talked about. And so it's really important that when we're talking about these types of things, that we use the proper terms. Individuals are not diverse. Individuals are not diverse. An entire group of people, that is what diversity is. But one individual is not diverse. So diversity especially, I see misused all the time. It's a huge pet peeve of mine. So if nothing else, if you walk away with nothing else tonight, please use diversity and diverse correctly. Multiculturalism. So this is the coexistence and acceptance of different cultural groups. So groups coming together and being together and acceptance of that. Equality versus equity. So I think this is really important, because I think so often people hear things like equity and they're like, I think there is a discomfort with the idea of things being potentially inequitable, or what people see as inequitable, when equity is being practiced. So in theory, we want things to be equal, right? We want kids and individuals to get approximately the same thing, right? To have the same opportunities, to have the same status, to have the same rights. But that's all other things being equal, right? And all things are not equal. So you can't come into a situation claiming that you're going to, give equality, when really what you're looking for is a fairness or impartiality in the way that you treat people, right? So I don't think we're in a school, right? There are no teachers in here, but I think if any teachers came in, they would nod their heads and agree that if you have a classroom with even like a small classroom, like say 12, 15 kids, right? If you walk into that classroom as a teacher and you say, I'm going to treat all these kids the same way, I'm just going to treat them equally, you are going to walk out at the end of the year with a lot of kids missing a lot of stuff. You're going to have a group of kids that are like behind, that like didn't really learn anything or that didn't learn as much as they should have. You'll have a group of kids who are bored to death because they were not challenged. And then you'll have a group in the middle, right? Depending on the distribution of the kids, it could be like more or less one way or the other. But if you are just equal in your treatment of those kids, you are not going to give them what they need. And so what we're looking for here is not necessarily equality in most cases, but it is equity. We want fairness, impartiality in the treatment of others. We want to impart justice. And inclusion is the act of being included within a structure or group, but it's also actively taking a stance against all forms of exclusion. That's really important. Not just that we are being inclusive and saying, yes, come in, but how are we making sure that other people, whoever they are not feeling like they're being excluded? Because you can't be fully inclusive unless you are actively working against exclusion. I once had someone say in a talk that I was in, oh gosh, now I'm going to forget the exact quote, but the only thing that we're intolerant of is intolerance. Like the only thing I am okay with being intolerant of is intolerance. And I was like, oh, I like that one. I'm gonna use that. But it's the same idea. Like if you are you're either completely inclusionary or you're being exclusionary. So you have to be careful. So what is culture, right? So culture is the customs, arts, achievements, traditions, and social institutions of a particular group of people who comprise a nation, an ethnicity, or social group. It's a wide group of different types of people, right? We think of a nation, right? I think of like, I know a lot of people, I don't know if you know a lot of people who are Francophiles, like people who love all things French. That's certainly a culture, right? An ethnicity, the Latino ethnicity is a great example of this. And in our census, it's ethnicity, not a race, and that's complicated, but that's how it's designated. And it's huge, right? It comprises almost every other race you can think of. And the thing that binds them together is the language, right? And then a social group. So I think when I think of like the social group piece of it, I think of like deaf culture. My mother was actually in education her whole life, but she started her career she was a teacher for the deaf. And so I got to grow up hearing a little bit about deaf culture, and I live not too far from Gallaudet University, and the advocacy that deaf advocates do on behalf of their group, their social group, their group with a particular disability is really incredible. And it is its own separate culture unto itself, for sure. So I think when we think of culture, we often think like, without a doubt, from the majority of people, the first thing that comes to mind is race. Easily number one, especially post George Floyd, right? Especially like our racial reckoning that we've had recently. Ethnicity comes in there, yeah, gender comes in there. And I think maybe the first six here. So like race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic class, status or class, sexual orientation and religion. We generally think about those, right? But all of these other areas are incorporated into culture and they all intersect with each other. It's very complicated, but yet like this is a part of it. And I think one of the things that's important to point out, because as we talk about this process and how we go through it, I'm going to encourage you all to make mistakes. I'm going to encourage you all to take risks. And so I have to talk a little bit about like, not mistakes per se that I've made, but like things that I've done that I've had to correct and do differently. So when I first started presenting on this, there were a few things that I hadn't included. So I didn't include body shape and size, right? Like that, in theory, I understood that was an important aspect of culture and something that, was important to pay attention to, but it wasn't something that I thought about actively. And I think with the health at every size movement and the body positivity movement is something that I had to realize, okay, this is something that I need to include. Same thing with gender identity and expression. For a long time, I didn't include those. I was like, oh, that's part of gender. Well, no, it's not. Gender identity and gender expression are quite different from the idea of gender itself. So it's important that we think about all of these different things and how they kind of intersect and interact with each other. And they're all a part of culture. They interact with each other. And yes, that is complicated, but it's, part of the tapestry of who we are. It's what makes us unique. It's what makes us interesting. And what's important for each of us is different for, for different individuals. So like I said before in my 7 word biographies, some of those things are incorporated in here, right? Some of them are not, that are maybe also important to me. So I am a native New Yorker and incredibly proud to be a native New Yorker. If you had met me like 20 years ago, I would have had like a thick Brooklyn accent, even though I'm not from Brooklyn. My family thought that was hilarious, that like around high school, I developed this like thick accent that went away when I went to college. But that was an important part of it still is an important part of who I am. I think being in New York, you can see I can project and talk loud and I gesticulate a lot. So that's an important part of who I am. Please, please. Yeah. Where? Yeah. Okay. Oh. Okay. Well, I'm kind of stuck because I have this cord anyway. So like if I wanted to step over it, that something would go wrong. I mean, it's okay. Yeah, that's all right. If I'm stuck, I'm stuck. That's fine. As long as it's okay for everyone. I'm good. Everyone. Okay. All right. Good, good. All right. So cultural competence. So now we're getting into the nitty gritty here. So cultural competence is having the awareness of one's, so I'm going to read it because sorry to do that. I hate doing that, but I think it's important. It's having an awareness of one's own cultural identity and views about difference. So this piece is important. So it is really important that you are aware of yourself first, right? In order to have cultural competence, you need to know who you are, right? And what your views are, right? What you think, right? What you've learned over the course of your own life, right? And it's the ability to learn and build on the varying cultural and community norms of others. So not only do you have awareness of yourself and awareness about your own views, but then how do you learn about other people? How do you build on what you already know with what you learn about others? It is the ability to understand the within group differences that make each person unique. And I think we talked a little bit about that, but there are a lot of within group differences, in that past thing I had of the list of culture, right? There are so many differences within those different groups. So I'll even go back. Let me see. Okay, nope, wrong way. So I think when we're not a part of a particular group, and science tells us this, when we're not a part of a particular group, we tend to think of the other as a monolith, as people who are all alike. But there are huge differences within each of these groups, right? So it's really important for us to think of the within group differences within each of these different cultures, right? So if we're gonna, okay, so like this, so I'll talk a little bit about the intersection of race and color, right? So, or at race/ethnicity and color. So if you think about like ethnicity, so I've talked to a lot of friends of mine, and I don't want to speak for an entire group that I'm not a part of, but the Latino community comprises lots of different races. I remember I think I was in graduate school when the census changed, and it changed from like to make Latino and Hispanic like an ethnicity as opposed to a race. And I had a lot of people up in arms who were like, well, what am I supposed to put? Like, so if someone is kind of like light brown skin, which a lot of Latinos/Hispanics are, they're like, well, I'm not Black. That doesn't seem right. I'm not white either. Definitely not Asian. Like, so they're like, what am I supposed to put? So that is really complicated, right? There's also incredible amounts of colorism within the Latino community, within the Black community, right? Like in this like, is lighter better? Like, has anyone read the book Their Eyes Were Watching God? Yeah, yeah. Fantastic book, read it if you haven't. And they talk a lot, like that book was published, I don't know how many years ago, probably almost 100 years ago at this point. And they talk, and the different groups, the main character in the book is a light-skinned Black woman. And there's a character in the book who talks about the importance of lightening up the race, like how it's important for her to be a part of the like kind of movement to lighten up the race. So there is incredible colorism within these different communities, right? So there are a lot of within group differences. Oop, I keep going the wrong way. Sorry about that. Okay. So it's important to understand the within group differences that make each person unique, but it's also important to celebrate the between group variations within the country and around the world. This part's really important. So the knowledge and awareness that you have, it coalesces into a set of congruent behaviors and attitudes that enable a person to work, play, and interact effectively in cross-cultural situations. This last sentence is really important. The knowledge and awareness is not enough, right? I think, again, with the whole, I had a lot of people coming to talk to me after George Floyd happened, when we were all shut in and like, just like kind of losing our minds inside. And then George Floyd happened, which actually I was blissfully unaware at the time, but it's a date that I'll always remember because it happens to be my birthday. So May 25th is my birthday. And I was like, okay, so this is what happens. And so I had a lot of people coming to talk to me, and they're like, I want to read more, I want to do more, and I want like this. And I'm like, that's great, but how is that going to change the way that you interact? How is that going to change your attitude? So having more knowledge is a wonderful start. Having more awareness is a wonderful start. But if that does not change into a behavioral change, into an attitude change, you're not doing enough. You're not doing enough. It has to go a step further. And when I say you, I mean everybody, your kids included. Okay. So why kids, right? Because, and I love this quote by Frederick Douglass, it's easier to build strong children than repair broken men. There's actually science behind this, right? Because our brains, and I tell this to my clients all the time in therapy, our brains do not fully form until we're in our mid-20s, right? There are so many connections that are being made when kids are little. Not to say that we stop learning or we stop having the ability to change when we're older, when we're our age, whatever age that is. But it is a lot easier to make changes when kids are little, because the things that we're teaching, they're not ingrained yet, right? They're starting to be, right? And these things like biases start really, really early. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. But they haven't taken root yet. They haven't taken hold yet. And as a parent, you have a lot of say and a lot of influence as to how they, how these potential biases, like how kids start to think about things so that it doesn't shift into a bias or it doesn't shift into discrimination, right? So biases in children and adults. So I think so often when we think about things like bias, we make the assumption that these are things that adults have, but, and I'll be talking about this in the next slide, but these are biases that start awfully early. So, and this is something I think that really, you can really see at an early age, the intergroup bias and the outgroup homogeneity bias. So the intergroup bias is the desire to believe that our group is the best, right? We want to believe that we're part of something that's really like the best, like, or else what's the point? Like we want to be the best. I actually saw this with my my fifth grader recently. She was talking about like her friendship groups and like she's very social, so she's got her girls or whatever. We asked something, I forgot, her dad and I like asked her something along the lines of like, how do you guys determine popularity? Who's most popular? And she's like, honestly, I think it's my group. I'm like, oh, okay. So I think, you see that developing pretty early on, right? But actually it develops even earlier than how old she is. But you want to believe that your group is the best. And you actually can start at an early age to devalue other groups by starting to privilege your own, by talking about how great your group is, right? So that's something we've had to actively work against, to say like, just because your group is great and we love your friends, however, like that doesn't mean anything negative about these other groups, right? This is especially important when groups and this happens a lot, even though we don't like to believe that this is the case, but groups can often be stratified by different areas of culture, by class for sure, by race for sure, definitely by gender, right? So there's that stratification in who's good and who's bad, right? Then the outgroup homogeneity bias. These are similar, but a little bit different. This is the assumption that one group is unique and special, while those in other groups are homogeneous, right? So for example, you think about like, I think a high school example like illustrates this a little bit better. So maybe there are two groups, one group is, tends to do their work. They do really well in school. They, they're really smart. They get good grades. They're really driven. Parents have a lot of money. have a lot of access, tend to be whiter, right? Then there's another group in school that maybe struggles a little bit more, has, like maybe some kids have special education services. Maybe they struggle with behavioral issues. Maybe they struggle with, their parents are struggling a little bit more. They're of lower SES or lower class. And that is, they have these like two separate groups. One is not necessarily better than the other. One might, struggle a little bit more. But they probably party about the same amount, right? Like they probably go out and drink and do drugs, probably about the same amount. But what you see over and over again is that the kids who are doing better in school are like, have their kind of stuff together versus the kids who like struggles in school who struggle more in school. The other group is given the benefit of the doubt. Oh, well, those kids, they're really stressed out. They have their APs coming. There's a situation that's happening. Their parents are working a lot. So like they couldn't, so they just went to this party and got, too drunk or whatever. Whereas like, well, that's what those kids do. That's what those kids do. And the high school example kind of illustrates it better, but we start to see this at a pretty early age. We start to see it pretty young. So before you know it, so it is true that kids are born as blank slates. It is true. But by 3 months of age, infants start to show preference for same race faces. So even though when they're born, because in a few studies that I've seen, in this particular study that I'm thinking of, they did look at kids pretty soon after birth to see if they showed any preference for same race faces. They did not. But in this particular group, it was what they called an orphanage. It was in another country. And there were a group of white kids who were adopted by white families and Black kids who were adopted by Black families. And then there were white and Black kids who were still in the orphanage, who were seeing faces, like a variety of faces, because there were a variety of caretakers. By 3 months of age, the white families that had been adopted to the white families and the Black families that had been adopted to the Black families started to show preference for those faces. The kids who were not yet adopted did not show that preference by 3 months. Now, are those kids saying like, oh, my family's better? No, we're not there yet. But the underpinnings for that kind of bias, the underpinnings for that kind of discrimination, it starts really, really soon. Yeah, please.
Same race as in the same race as the infant, or same race as the primary caregiver?
Same, both. So in this particular study, the kids were adopted by people of their own race, right? The studies that I'm not as sure about is if like they are adopted by a different, if like someone is adopted, like a Black kid is adopted by a white family, or an Asian kid is adopted by a Black family, whatever. That I'm not as sure about as how that works, but it is my guess though, based on this study, is that the child would start to show preference for whatever face they were seeing, whatever face you're seeing, right? Which, I'm trying to think at like 3 months old, my kid wasn't looking at a mirror very often, right? Yeah. And like I said, in my family, like I said, my husband's white. My kids are looking at both like, faces for sure. And then like with my parents and like, all of that. But so I don't know if my kids showed a preference, but infants they do have the ability at this early on in age, if they're with the same race pretty consistently, they can show that preference at that age. Yep. By 4 years of age, kids are starting to learn to generalize about people based on categorical information. So this study looked at so basically the researchers gave kids, they gave them information about made up people. So I think the example that was given in the study was like, they said, the researcher told the kid this Wei-Shan is obviously not a made up thing. With this Wei-Shan goes glaving. This particular Wei-Shan goes glaving. And the assumption that a lot of the kids would start to make is that all Wei-Shans go glaving, right?
These are made up words.
These are made up words, right? Correct. Because then the kid doesn't have, doesn't have any like context for what these different things are. But these children are making assumptions based on this one particular person's experience that was true for everybody of that group, right? And what we do know about our country, about our world, is that our neighborhoods tend to be pretty homogeneous, right? So for a lot of 4-year-olds, like, people of different colors are made up people. Those are people they see on TV, not people they see in real life, right? Or they are people with disabilities, or people with different religions, or like, pick your poison. But for a lot of kids, those things are made up people at age 4, right? If you don't see them in person or very infrequently, those things are made up, right? So kids start to do this generalization by age 4. By 5, kids are already starting to be sensitive to the status of their social group. They're already starting to notice like kind of the hierarchies and where people are located. So like my little girl was saying, in 5th grade at 11, that she was seeing this status, but also, they're probably a lot younger, especially her, knowing my daughter, was noticing that a lot earlier. By 6 years of age, kids are already starting to show own race preferences that are nearly identical to adults. Nearly identical. Not quite there, but pretty close. Yeah.
I just want to my own race preferences. That's like
your own particular race. Yes. Yes. And also by 6 years, children are beginning to develop a strong dislike to people who are not a part of their group. A strong dislike. By 8, kids are willing to discriminate against people in an outgroup in order to show love towards their own group. So putting down other kids, teasing other kids, spreading rumors, that can start at 8 as a way of showing loyalty to your own group. So again, I hear a lot from parents who worry that, are we talking about this too early? Maybe like this is too much for kids. They're already doing this. They're already noticing. The question is, what are they going to notice? What is going to be important? I actually, when I was my year in between undergrad and grad school, I taught at a school, a preschool, and I taught 3-year-olds. Super fun. They were very cute. They're exhausting, but really cute. And I was, this was for many years ago, and I was one of like 2 teachers of color, I believe, in that school. And most of the kids, not all of them, the majority of the kids were white. And the kids would so frequently say things to me like, they'd be like, "Oh, your skin is darker than mine." And I'm like, yeah, it is. Or sometimes they would say, "Oh, your skin is darker because you spend more time in the sun." And I'm like, well, no, not quite. And I love that example too, because I feel like that probably, like, I can imagine that a kid would come to that kind of conclusion based on true information, right? Like, their family goes on a beach vacation, somebody comes home with a tan, and they're like, "Oh, why are you darker?" "Well, I spent time in the sun," right? And they like made that equivalent that like, "Oh, I must spend all this time in the sun." And the thing that was so interesting to me about all of that was that I had no problem with these 3-year-olds coming to me and saying these things. I was like, yeah, like, I have no problem talking about my skin color. But if I had and sometimes they said these things to me when like other teachers weren't around, and sometimes they said it when they were, or a parent was around. And when somebody heard this, when other teachers heard this, they were often horrified. Like, "We can't be talking about this. What did you say?" In this way that like, and I understand it. I think that they were trying to maybe protect me, or like, not make things uncomfortable. But I think that if kids are noticing these things and they're talking about them, I'm never going to get mad at a 3-year-old for commenting on my skin. Like, never. Everybody's different. I can't even imagine getting mad at a 3-year-old for saying something like truly discriminatory, because my thought is like, where did they learn that? Right? Like, that doesn't come from them. But I think when you get to an older age, right, and you start to make these kinds of mistakes, that's when things that's when things are heightened. That's when you get in trouble at school. That's when there are issues and there's likely less of a conversation. And so I really, really feel strongly that it's important to have these conversations as young as possible based on this information and just generally. But I want to make a note before we jump into kind of some of the different things that we can do about cultural competence. Cultural competence is not fully attainable, right? I do not want you to approach this process thinking, what steps do we take to arrive? There is no arrival, right? It is not possible to know everything there is to know about every culture out there. That is just not possible. I sure as heck am not culturally competent. And the world is changing all the time. And the way we understand, like the way that different groups interact, the cultural context is changing all the time. And it's just not possible to know everything. The idea is that we want to keep trying, in the same way that like, you know, we're not ever going to know everything there is to know about technology. Even people who work in technology are like, I don't understand this, what AI, what? Like nobody understands fully everything. But you keep updating your phone, right? It's not like you like get an iPhone 6 and never upgrade, right? Like you have to get a new phone or else your phone is not going to be working anymore, right? So you have to continually upgrade, keep working at it. So I'm going to briefly go through what I think of as the essential elements of a culturally competent kid. So what are we working towards? What are we trying to work on? So the first thing is awareness. So we want our kids, and this is true not just for kids, but for us as adults as well. We want kids to be aware of themselves, as I said earlier, aware of others, right? And aware of context, right? So if we're traveling or something like that, like in the way that we carry ourselves is not going to be the same as the way that we carry ourselves when we're home in our, you know, in our homeschool and with our friends, right? We have to be aware of how our context is different from maybe some others, and how who we are and how we move through the world changes depending on who we're with and where we are. It's important to have historical knowledge, right? So how did we arrive where we are with lots of different areas? I think obviously the area that everybody's thinking about and talking about right now is, you know, the war happening in the Middle East. You cannot understand, not that I think anyone fully understands at this point, everything that's going on in the entire conflict and all of that without understanding the historical context of what happened there. If you were to read, say, a news story that came out in 2024 and said like, oh, I get it. No, you don't, because there's so much historical context there, right? So it's important to understand the history of things and how we arrive where we are in order to be culturally competent. And again, you can't know everything about everyone. So, so the basics will do here, but you do need historical knowledge. You need to be open, right? Open to new experience, open to new people. I personally think the best way to be open is food. Easily. I love like trying new foods. I think being here in the DC area, being in any major city, especially, it's just so easy to access different types of foods. And I think that's one of my favorite ways to be open to new experiences. I think it's a great thing to do with kids also. But you want to be open to people, you want to be open to new things. Discernment. So this I feel like is just a general life skill that you know, modern parents have to do no matter what. There is just so much information out there. There's so much data. There's so much, you know, that is going around on the internet that we have to teach our kids how to separate fact from fiction. We need to teach our kids to discriminate between what they see online and what's real. So I'll give an example from my own kiddos. So I have an 8th grader who watches a lot of YouTube. Some of you may be able to relate. And especially during COVID, that was the thing of choice. But so sometimes he'll come to me and his sister and father, and he'll give me a fact of something that he deems a fact. And I'm like, where did you learn that? And he's like, oh, this YouTube channel. I'm like, okay, well, that doesn't mean it's not true. That doesn't mean it's necessarily 100% false. But like, who would put up this YouTube channel? Where did they get their information? Do you have anything else that backs this up? So like just teaching your kids that one source of something is usually not enough, right? That you have to find multiple sources in order to really determine what's real and what's not. And then some things are just not real. Like some things that some people say or some things that are on the internet are just not real. I mean, and we won't get into like lots of other things like deep fakes and all that. Like, oh, but I think it's important to teach our kids, like, you know, there's so much out there. What do we pay attention to and what can we push to the side? Not just with cultural competence, but that is a life skill. That is an important life skill. Internalizing. So I think so often when we talk about culture, because it can be uncomfortable, because I don't know about the rest of y'all, but I grew up in the like, if we don't talk about it, then everything's fine generation, right? Like, we don't need to talk about this, it's totally fine, right? So I think nobody, like, so often, like, we just never talked about it. And I think when we as a culture said, okay, we'll start talking about this, it was of this like, oh, this is something that's happening over there or happening to them or what they are doing, right? There's less of like, this is happening to us. This is something that I'm a part of. Like the example I gave of being a psychologist. And, you know, I own that. And I'm not responsible for that. I didn't cause it, but I own that, right? And I'm responsible for changing it, right? So I think it's so important. I think, you know, now with the whole, you know, thing of like banned books and all of this stuff, I think people are trying to avoid their kids feeling bad. And I don't want any kid to feel bad per se. But I think that if you don't internalize that this is something that you are a part of, then you don't feel that you have the ability to change it. You don't have agency, or you don't feel like you have agency. And I think if we want our kids to, again, not just have knowledge and awareness, but have that translate to behavior and attitudes, to things that can actually change the world, really, then they're going to have to internalize that they're a part of this, that this is them, this is us, this is me, not just other people out there. Adaptation. So we want our kids to be able to adapt to new situations, to adapt to new people, to not just think that, you know, they can kind of act the same way no matter where they are. I constantly tell my kids when they talk about certain things, I'm like, would you say that in front of your grandmother? Nana wouldn't like that. Please don't say that. They're like, no, I'm not saying it for me. But the same idea, and that's a part of culture, right? Because that's important as well. So it's important to adapt to different situations depending on what's going on. And then coping skills. Throughout this process, you will make mistakes. Your kids will make mistakes. We all make mistakes. I still make mistakes, right? It's important for us to not get, I think it's easy to feel shame, to get stuck in like this spiral of feeling bad about it. And like, how could I have said that? That was so awful. I didn't mean it. Will everyone judge me? Oh my goodness. And then you get into the shame spiral and then you never talk. And then you like move to never talking about it again. It's really important that we as parents model for our kids that, like, first of all, that you will make mistakes. And that when you do make those mistakes, it's okay. I'll give you hugs and kisses and we'll learn from it and then we'll keep it moving. Because if we stay in that shame cycle, we're never gonna like get out of it. And then we're never gonna continue to have these conversations, continue to learn. Yeah.
So just to ask you, there's no hint here of what's taboo and what is not acceptable, or that you will be severely ostracized or penalized or held accountable if you do it. So, you know, when I was growing up, the N-word was still not 100% prescribed or something prescribed, right? And now it is. And that's something that I think we all in some shape probably have shared with children.
Yes,
but
yes.
There is a lot of transgressive or deliberately provocative behavior that kids are inundated with. And so the elements that you're describing there don't necessarily say like what's out of bounds.
And there's a reason I don't do that, which is true. There are certain things that are completely out of bounds. I'm not going to put any of that in writing. I'm not going to put it because it probably will change. It probably will change. There are certain things that we say today that in 30 years, our grandkids are going to be like, well, you said what? Like, I'm sorry, that's not okay. Right. And so I know that there are overall words or overall things that you absolutely cannot say. Those things are also constantly changing. I don't have a list. I don't have a list. And I think that as individuals, as parents, as like, and I'll tell you what I encourage parents to do, and I encourage my kids to do this, is to tell me when I've said something that's not okay, right? There are definitely things that I've said, and I can't think of a good example at this point, where my kids are like, no, nobody says that anymore. Like, you can't, you don't, we're not saying no. And so I think that yes, there are absolutely words out there that like you can't say, but you have to be careful about it. So for example, like the N-word, like y'all can't say it, but I can, right? And I have plenty of friends, Black friends who do, and it's not a problem, right? Same thing with the F word for gay people. Like I have plenty of friends who are gay who will say the F word among themselves, and that's fine for them, right? Because they've taken that word back, because they own that word, right? So it depends on context. It depends on the individual. But then also I have like my parents, I would freak out if they ever heard that word, right? Like my mom would be like, that's not acceptable ever to say the N-word under any circumstances, right? It depends, there's a lot of context there. There's a lot of context there. So I think it depends a lot on the individuals and depends a lot on your own values. But yes, there are some words that like you absolutely cannot say. There's certain words that I can't say. There's certain words that other people can't say. And I think as a family, as a community, as whatever, you determine what that list is for your kids individually. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's a good question. Yeah. Or comment. Did I answer it? Was it a question? Okay. Right. So this is the general framework, and we're just going to be talking about construction today. So it's kind of two parts. Construction is like just like the first issue. This is kind of like as things go along, how do we keep it going? But we're just gonna go with construction today. And so again, what I'm really hoping is that you'll walk away today with very specific things to do. I have a handout, and you all who are here can take it, with lots of different exercises and activities to do both on your own and with kids. I can send, yes, please pass it out. And then I can certainly send it so that people who are on Zoom can have access to it as well. Excuse me, but there are lots of different potential things to work on and to do with kids. To do, yeah.
I remember picking up my son when he was 4 to preschool, and he said, Mom, why is my teacher Black?
Mm-hmm.
And all the parents were around me, and I froze, and I just said, because her parents are, like, because I didn't know, like, how do you explain that? And I feel like, and that's the historical context and the knowledge and whatnot. But I feel like as they're getting older, questions are becoming more complicated.
Yeah.
And it's like, how do you sift through that? How do you sort what's appropriate, what's not? And a friend of mine always saying, like, don't prove to your kids you're woke if you just look ridiculous, And I think there's some truth to that. It's kind of like, I'm only intolerant of my colleagues. It's we get caught up in that.
Yeah.
It's hard to be thoughtful in all of this discussion and pass that on to your kids, and yet also create this environment where they can come to you. You're not going to shut them down, or shame them. But then there's probably going to be times when that would be appropriate. I mean, just in a sense of like, that's a word that we do not say, like being very fierce about it. You don't, it is severe, I mean, I think that's difficult to navigate. I don't know where to go with that.
So I'm trying to figure out exactly what you're asking. So when your kid comes to you with a specific question, both when they're young and as they get older, like, how do you answer it?
Yeah, how do you answer it like in an age appropriate way? that answers your question and continues the discussion versus, just like showing them how progressive you are in your response, like how do you include them in the conversation and explain, like, this is the context of it, this is why this is a problem, this is why, you shouldn't say it. I mean, I think they're taught a lot from their peers and from school, but, I don't know, sometimes I don't know the balance there of what's too much information when I'm just lecturing at them versus having a really thoughtful conversation where we understand each other better and understand the context of what they're asking.
So I think I would have to hear all the individual questions that you're talking about to adequately answer. I think, so I'm thinking about the first question that you're asking about, like a 4-year-old coming and saying, like, why is my teacher Black? I would say, I think there are lots of different ways to answer that question. And I love answering questions like that with a question. Why do you think your teacher is Black? What do you think about your teacher being Black? Have you been talking in school about your teacher being Black? What do you think your teacher would say about them being Black, right? So there are lots of different ways to answer that question that doesn't necessarily answer the question, that allows for a conversation, and allows them to continue to explore without feeling like because there's nothing wrong with a question like that. There's nothing wrong with a question like that. Like, did you have a question?
Oh, I still thought I wanted
okay. Yeah. Yeah, for that, to me, especially as a 4-year-old, that's when you really want to answer their questions, right? Or where you want to have conversations about these types of things or talk about these types of things, because I don't see 4-year-olds as making mistakes around this kind of thing. They're only repeating things that they've heard or the things that they've learned, right? So if they're giving you misinformation or you're thinking that they're giving misinformation, then you want to correct it, just like you would correct anything else, right? But I think being curious about why they're asking the question or going deeper into in an age appropriate way by asking additional questions is a great way to keep that conversation going. I mean, and you can give me other examples of other questions, because I know that's a 4-year-old and your kids are older, but yeah, I think you can continue to do that as kids get older as well. Yeah.
And there have been a lot of questions, but I just don't want to shut it. That's
yes. I really love answering questions with questions. I think that can be really powerful. I do that in therapy a lot to keep the conversation going. And also because, like, let's be honest, most of the questions that our kids ask us, especially around this topic, we don't know the answer to it. We don't know the answer. And I think that's part of the reason why this topic is so fraught for so many parents, is because they're used to being asked questions they know the answer to. And it's okay that you don't know the answer. I am a big fan of, I don't know, let's Google it, or let's find out together, or let's find out more together, or let's talk to somebody else about that together, right? Do not feel like you have to give them the answer. Especially as kids get older, encourage them. You can encourage them to find out that answer on their own. You can encourage them to talk to other people about it. You can encourage them to do their own research, right? Whatever that means, depending on their age. But do not feel like you have to give them the answer, because frankly, you probably don't know what the answer is. Yeah.
I know, I was just gonna say, I noticed something that seems sort of parallel to something that I think about a lot, which is how we talk or don't talk to kids about sex. And how
Ooh, I have a friend for you. I have a colleague for you. Oh, no.
Terrible things, and it's not how we approach anything. It seems to me that things that make us uncomfortable, generally we do kind of find that advice, some of us, kind of appealing, because it takes some of the burden off of us.
That's
right?
correct.
To wait for the kid to do it. But the thing about kids is, especially as they get older, they're exquisitely sensitive to things that make you uncomfortable.
They sure
And
are.
they stop asking. right? Because they've realized that like, that's a weird question, and then you said, let's talk about it later, and then we never do talk about it,
Right.
right?
I'm a huge fan of saying, let's talk about later, because kids have a gift for asking questions at a time when you're just like, we don't have time to talk about this. But then you actually have to, so this is what our phones are for, right? Like put a reminder in your phone to bring it up again. Yes, those types of things are really important. And if at all possible, I know that there are exceptions. But if at all possible, please, please, please do not shush your kids when they ask these type of questions. When I've said them, my parents love bringing up all the embarrassing things I used to say when I was younger. And I grew up, so for example, I grew up in a very white town. Like I think my high school was maybe, well, I know what I do know is that Black people were the largest like non-white group, and there were like 3% of us. Like it was a very, very white town. And so I grew up mostly around white people, like in my everyday life, but I had a lot of family. I grew up in New York. I had a lot of family still in the city. And I went out to brunch, I think, of some, in some kind when I was maybe 5, 6, 7 years old. And I had, apparently, this is what I've been told, I had this voice when I was that age. Like I had a booming, deep voice when I was younger. And apparently I sat down, I looked around and I said, boy, there are a lot of Black people in here. And my mom and uncle were horrified. And they still bring it up to this day, just to, now, like I said, I was part of the generation where we didn't talk about that. My mom did not prescribe to that. She definitely shushed me at that time. That was probably appropriate at the time. But for the most part, I had parents that talked to me about this kind of stuff. Probably not as much as maybe they could have or should have or whatever you want to say, but they definitely talked to me about race. They talked to me about gender. They talked to me about, like I said, my mom worked in special education, so we talked a lot about disability. So we talked a lot about culture in my family. I'm not saying that I'm 100% comfortable with it all the time. I am not. I'm not saying I'm still a product of my generation, right? But I am more comfortable with it than I think a lot of people of my generation as well, because I had parents that would have these conversations. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? And about the topic about sex, I do have a colleague who talks about talking to your kids about sex in their bodies, and her talk is amazing. So if you want her information, she's incredible. So the first step in the framework is called preparation. It's the foundation. Please, please, please do not skip this part, because if you skip this part, it's going to undermine the rest of your work in this process. It does not include your kids. It's all your own internal work. That's all it is. It's about learning what your implicit biases are, kind of where they lie, your relationship with culture, your relationship with different things. Notice that I didn't say if you have implicit biases. I said what they are and where they lie, right? Everybody has biases. They exist for all of us. It's just about becoming aware of where yours are. If you do not know where yours are, it will undermine this whole process. Our kids, I'm not telling anyone anything they don't know. Kids are smart. They can pick up on stuff. If we are uncomfortable having these conversations, if we do not truly value some of the things that we're saying, our kids know. They know. So we need to do our own internal work so that whatever we're doing doesn't undermine everything else that we're saying. So I know we're running lowish on time, and so I won't go into a lot of detail about this. Like I said, I have these handouts. If I can recommend anything from this list, I would recommend the implicit association test. It's super easy. You go online, you take a bunch of tests, you learn about your biases. It's amazing. It's like a study. There's lots of different, it's like Harvard and a bunch of other, like, I think it was just Harvard, and now they do work with lots of other groups. And it only takes a few minutes to take some of these tests. I actually need to retake it because it's been a while since I've taken it. And it gives you lots of great information. So yeah, if I can recommend anything from that one list, that's what I would say. Yeah. Oh, cultural self-care. So cultural self-care is just like any other self-care. It's about, like I said, in this process, you are going to make mistakes. Your kids are going to make mistakes. You're going to learn things that are uncomfortable for you about who you are and the way that you think and what you've been taught. And so it's important throughout the process to have a system, whatever that is for you, of caring for yourself when this work is hard. So who do you talk to? Who do you, how do you kind of take a break from it all, but then go back to it? Do you have a partner that you can talk to about this? Do you have friends? Can you create a group? Like we're talking to a group here at a school. Can we create a group where we all talk about some of the work that we're doing, what we're talking to our kids about, how we problem solve this, right? It is a way of thinking critically about how you care for yourself when you're doing this kind of work. Because if you're only thinking about your kids and how you're trying to impart this knowledge on them, but you're not thinking about how this can, I'm not saying that this work has to be drudgery. It's not. It can be a lot of fun, right? But there are parts of it that are hard. And if we're not taking care of ourselves during that, we're never going to go back to it, right? So it's about thinking critically about how to take care of yourself while you're going through this. Good question. All right. So modeling, so it's the next step, and it's about not just being aware of what your biases are, but what they're showing your kids. So basically, what about your nonverbal communication? The way that you're kind of engaging with your kids. How is that? What is that teaching them, right? So I think you actually gave some good examples here, and I think it's important to think about the words that you're using, to admit the words that you're uncomfortable about. I think, again, if I can recommend any one thing from this list, is to be the awareness of your nonverbals, right? Like your nonverbal. So we are not always aware of we tend to be more aware of the words that we are using as opposed to our body posture when we're doing those words, or the tone of voice that we're using, or our eye contact. But this is about kind of bringing awareness to all of those nonverbal pieces of this when you're having these conversations with your kids. So it's about practicing talking about this with other people. It's about just kind of raising that awareness of asking your kids for feedback, asking them to tell you, like, if they're noticing anything about the way that you're saying things, or just admitting to them, like, we didn't talk about this when I was your age. This wasn't something that was acceptable to really have deep conversations about when I was your age, but it's important to me and I want to do more of it. So if I seem uncomfortable, I am, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't talk about this. Okay. I love the Guess Who's Not Coming to Dinner, the play on words there with the old movie from Sidney Poitier. And it's this awareness of what your kids see. So, a lot of us work and we go off to work, and there's lots of people that we see around us that we kind of have in our orbit. But what do your kids see, right? Who do you talk to on the school cafeteria and on the school playground? Who is coming over to your house for dinner? Who do you tend to have who do you tend to have over with play dates, so you might see your orbit and the people that you interact with as more diverse than what your kids actually see, right? And that's often true. So this is about bringing kind of awareness into that as well. So the modeling piece of it is like, what is our behavior, our actions, our words, what are they showing our kids? Infusion. This is my favorite part of the framework, easily, because it's supposed to be fun. And it's just about making culture and diversity part of your everyday lives. It's integrated into what you already do. It's not new, not more, you're just shifting things. So this is just an overall idea. So if your family loves to read, just incorporate more diverse books into your library. Even though there are not nearly, by percentage, there are not nearly enough diverse books out there. There are more books that have animals as main characters than people, of diversity as the main character. But they definitely exist. There are lots of diverse children's books out there, a lot. So make sure that you're incorporating that into your family's library or your school library as well. If your kid loves toys, there's so many different types of toys out there that your kid can utilize. I love going to specialty museums. I think a lot of people think of the African American Museum, and that one's great. I love it. I hate that we have to get tickets still. That really bothers me. But there are so many small, tiny museums. There's a Woman in the Arts Museum, and the Freer Gallery, the Asian American Art Museum is amazing. And in DC, like almost all of our museums are free. So it's just, yeah. So if your family loves to go to museums, look for the little ones because they're really incredible too. If your child loves fashion, a variety of that. So tonight is actually the Met Gala. I don't know if you guys, I really appreciate you being here because we're missing the red carpet. I'm hoping to get like a full, thing from my 11-year-old. But I think, when I was thinking about this particular topic in the Met Gala in particular, what was it, either last year or the year before, there was a celebration of Karl Lagerfeld, who had recently passed away, who in every respect was an amazing fashion designer, but he was also really problematic, right? He had major issues with like body size and shape, major race issues, like was a bit of a misogynist, if you really think, and I hate to speak ill of the dead, but like he has a complicated history. Let's just put it that way. That was talked about a little bit at the Met, but not that much. So I think, if your kid loves fashion, it's okay to talk about that. Like if they're into the Met, this is the thing to look at. So if they're into fashion, the Met is the thing. So you can talk about this complicated history that someone like Karl Lagerfeld, one of the greatest designers out there, is still a complicated figure. You can talk about how Zendaya, I don't know one kid like from like 5 to like 25 who doesn't love Zendaya. I don't know about y'all if your kids like her, but she is one of the co-chairs of the Met Gala this year, and she's known for her fashion, and her designer is a Black male, and gay Black male, and like there's a lot out there about her relationship with this designer and the importance of their relationship and how they incorporate Black designers. Beyonce too does a lot of that work where she talks about like how she chooses Blackness in her art, right? So you can have those kinds of conversations and talk about those things while watching the red carpet. If your family loves sports, Colin Kaepernick is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so many diversity issues in sports. I won't even go there, but I think one of the things that's actually not true. One of the things that I will note real quick is that Brittany Griner is actually starting to talk about her story. You all know Brittany Griner was the woman who was stuck in Russia, in prison in Russia, and obviously part of the reason that she was there is to earn more money, just because female basketball players make so much less money than the male basketball players, like wildly different amounts of money. And in some sports, it's a little bit more equal. My kids play tennis. I know that like the Williams sisters and a lot of other women did a lot of work around that. Billie Jean King did a lot of work around that to make the prizes a little bit more equal. But there's still like, depending on the sport, just like massive amounts of inequality. And that's what caused her to have to work during the off season in Russia and then cost her imprisonment. So especially I think with slightly older kids, she's starting to talk about her story. There are articles out there, so you can start talking about these things as well if your family loves basketball. And then food. I think food is just like the best thing best way to incorporate different things. And then discussion. So discussion is kind of the natural next step, or like it almost is something that you do as a part of infusion. It's a great bonding time. It's a great way to solidify information. It doesn't have to be long. You don't have to lecture your kids. You definitely don't have to lecture to them, but it has to be meaningful. So it's important to kind of connect these things to their interests, and make it something that they're aware of and something that means something to them. So if your kids, like the example with sports, so if your kids play basketball, don't talk about tennis, they'll be bored to tears. Like talk about basketball and the inequities there. Entry points are just different ways to start a conversation. I provide some entry points on the thing that I said there. The thing that we talked about this a little bit already, questions. It's so important to answer your kids' questions, but also ask them questions. Ask questions, question after question after question. And this can take practice. Like it's something where, you might think something in your head, but then you don't say it out loud. Feel free to have a stream of consciousness in front of your kids. Feel free to just kind of talk out loud. An easier way to do that, I think, is to involve others. So I love having conversations about different topics of diversity in front of my kids, right? So, and when I go to visit, my parents live on the Eastern Shore, and I'm just thinking about them because I'll be there for Mother's Day. And when my sister and her husband, and then myself and my husband and our kids, and we all come and inevitably sit around the dining table. And we tend to just talk about like stuff. And the kids are kind of in and out. Sometimes they're in the living room, which is kind of adjacent, so they can hear us. Sometimes they're outside, like, so they're kind of in and out. They're always getting food, obviously, so the dining room is a good place. But they hear some of what we're saying. They don't always pay attention. They're not always like, tell me more about that, but they will sometimes jump in, and they will often hear what's happening. Sometimes even, as we're having these conversations, I think they're not listening, but then in the car ride home, I can hear my kids being, asking these different questions. And then always, always, always emphasize humanity, right? Like these are people. We want to keep that in mind. We are really running low. Okay. Sorry, does anyone know what this is? Anyone here, Gardner? It's mint, that's right. Oh, I'll show the quote too. The reason I put the mint up is because mint is a weed. I don't know if anyone knows this. I didn't know this when I was first gardening, but mint spreads. And if you plant it, it will never go away. That's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to plant something that's going to spread, that's never going to go away. So it is not in our difference. It is not our differences that divide us. It is our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences. So the point is not to pretend the differences aren't there. The point is to be able to talk about them and celebrate them. So make sure you keep it going. Be consistent with your conversations. Don't feel like you need to know all the answers because you're growing with your kids, right? You're not imparting your knowledge. You're teaching them ways to figure this stuff out on their own as well. You don't have to be perfect, and you don't need to know all the answers. It's the most important thing to do is be willing and show up consistently, consistently, consistently. Okay. And that's it. So questions, comments. Thank you all. There is something in the chat here. Okay, that was you. But if anyone has any questions, I know it's late. We have like 5 minutes. So if anyone has any questions, they could put in the chat, or they can just open up the thing. But yeah, please do. Thank you.
One thing it rings very true, or hits home in what you said, was something that I noticed early in our kids' lives, which is that the worlds that I inhabited before having kids and in the workplace and stuff were much more diverse than the worlds that they were encountering in preschool and in their neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
And so my daughter would ask questions like, why is everybody in our neighborhood white? And I was horrified when she did that, because when I conceived her, we lived in Harlem, right? And I was like, oh, and in fact, you were correct.
Right.
that is true. And so for a parent who on any one of those different sort of measures of diversity that you've helpfully outlined, and there's so many, I love the attention to family structure, to so many different things on there.
Mm-hmm.
My daughter also asked me when she was fairly young, like, why we didn't know any gay people. And I was like, well, I know tons of gay people, but they're not hanging out with my daughter.
Right.
I mean, as it happens, they might be, but but they weren't at that time.
Right.
And so I guess a question I have is, in addition to the food and the art and being creative, in terms of just sort of being out exploring the world in your time as a family, I do wonder sometimes, like, what else I could be doing to expose my kids to people who are different, whether it's in like after school activities, whether it's in summer camps, whether it's, I don't know, it's a bit tricky because it's not like I'm looking for, there isn't one type of diversity that I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But I think of the fact that I went to elementary school that had a huge disability program, and how like rich and valuable that experience was.
Right.
Really, helped me as a person. And I sort of wonder if you have any other thoughts about those types of things. Like
I-
do in addition to what you was saying.
Yes, well, you have to be careful with that because you have to be really, right. And you don't want to tokenize, right? Like, we don't want to just say like, oh, go make friends with that gay person. Like, that's not how friendships work. So you have to be careful with it. But I do think there is a lot of power in showing more of yourself to your kids and who you are friends with and who you have relationships with. My family had a really close, my father who passed away, had a very close relationship with a man who his was a huge disability rights advocate and did a lot of work around that and we would just go out to dinner and he like with him, like we would just kind of, and it's not like I was hanging out with him, right? But I was there when he was talking to and so I think that actually is really powerful to show your kids feedback here. To show your kids, sorry, I'm like hearing myself in my ear. To show your kids what's important to you, as well as like, you know, if you can expand more to different things, people that they're exposed to, I think that's great. But I think if you already have relationships like that, or you already have people in your life, if there are ways that feel natural, that is okay, yeah. I know we have. Yes, this is true.
There's, you know, how siloed our media consumption is now, and how I feel like that is, you know, so that's another.
Yeah, it's another topic for another day. I don't have a good answer to that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. All right. All right.
So Samantha, can I take another run at him?
Yes,
I
please.
love this presentation. One of the places where we as a fan are really putting up against the wall is that kids are doing things in proximity to our
Mhm.
that is shocking, like using really charged, horrible racist language or imagery. Or misogynist, all the things. And then if there's like, oh, can't help that, you know, whereas like, I mean, coming back to my roots, like you get kicked out of school or you would face a serious reaction as opposed to kids are just gonna be kids or the society, you know, we have a presidential candidate who's, you know, using these horrible, you know, images himself, right? So it's all mainstream, right? Right? But I mean, I'm sorry, just within your framework, there is a kind of out of bounds problem.
No, I totally,
right?
yeah, I totally hear that. And it's, like I said, it's tricky because it is a moving target. And I mean, yes, there are certain things that you just say, but I do think too, the consequences for different people, like the conflict, really are like very different. And how that was talked about, and in some places there are no consequences, like very limited. Yeah. Oh, well, that's a fee.
Yeah, no, I was like, I was getting texts too from people. She's amazing. A couple people were like, I have to go because my kid is going to sleep. But whenever like, don't be offended that I'm.
Yeah,
So, which is okay if I take these extra.
yeah,
copies
go,
to the
yeah,
staff.
go right ahead. And things like, whatever, just remind me.